So welcome to this Ukraine REACH presentation on specifically the registration process. And we will not go into the details and technical details of the registration process, but more so give you an overview of the Ukraine REACH registration process. And this is a follow-up presentation to the pre-registration focused video that you will also find here on YouTube. So I'm Fredrik Johansson, I'm a partner, head of sales here at REACHLaw, and I will be guiding you through these topics today. And the topics to be discussed are, first and foremost, to just give you a quick overview of REACHLaw. Then we'll have a quick overview of the registration process basics in Ukraine. Then we'll look at a bit of the timelines for pre-registration and registration, so a bit of overlap here to the previous video on specifically pre-registration, a bit on the joint submission concept, registration workflow. This is where we're going to the registration specific stuff. We'll look at what is a lead registrant and who is a co-registrant and what are their individual duties. And then we'll look at this simplified registration of EU REACH registered substances that is quite unique to Ukraine REACH. Look at the deadlines again, a bit on the IT systems, and of course on the authority registration fees, and at the end how you can get in touch with REACHLaw if you need support with Ukraine REACH related topics. So we start with REACHLaw in brief. So who are we and what's our focus? So we provide support for REACH, so EU REACH that is, and REACH-like chemical regulations globally. So on the map here you can see these listed out more or less. So of course EU REACH and CLP here in the EU and the European Economic Area, whereby we service this field from our head office here in Finland, in Helsinki. But we also support UK REACH and GBCLP related compliance topics, and that is serviced through our subsidiary in the UK, Manchester. We also have a small office in Brussels, but that is more focused on IT related services, so we'll not go into details here. Then for Turkey, KKD, IK and SEA, so the Turkish equivalent of CLP, this is serviced through our subsidiary in Istanbul, and of course office there in Turkey. Then in Seoul in South Korea we also have a subsidiary, REACHLaw Korea, through which we provide services pertaining to foremost K-REACH and K-OSHA. We also have an office in New Delhi in India, servicing the local market for compliance for all of these regulations, but then also specifically on India BIS. And if India REACH ever enters into force, of course we will also be servicing that, but I'm not hopeful, very hopeful at least on that. And then last but not least, the topic of today, of course, Ukraine REACH and CLP. Ukraine REACH will be the topic of today. And we now also have a subsidiary in Kyiv, REACHLaw Ukraine. And through this office, we will be servicing Ukraine REACH and CLP related topics. And speaking of services pertaining to Ukraine REACH and CLP, we will provide a full suite of services, everything you need to comply with Ukraine REACH and CLP, such as providing, of course, only representative services for those of you who are not physically present on the Ukrainian market but are supplying chemicals there. You can appoint REACHLaw as an only representative. There are some caveats to that. We will discuss that in a separate video. But as an only representative or supporting local Ukrainian industry, of course, help with the practical work pertaining to pre-registration, co-registration, simplified, or this regular, if you will, registration, and then lead registration work, and of course all the related stuff such as managing SIEVs and consortia where applicable, and of course doing the how do you say, the more day-to-day operations of safety data sheet authoring and CLP labels, but also doing CLP notifications and group notifications, of course, and providing consultancy, training, etc., as is needed by our clientele. So please feel free if you have questions on our services and, of course, need support with Ukraine REACH and CLP, for example, you need an only representative, just reach out to REACHLaw. We'll be happy to help. You will find our contact details at the end of this presentation. So just before we go into the meat and potatoes of this presentation, just some notes that some aspects of Ukraine REACH are still a bit unclear, to say the least. Therefore, some parts of the presentation may be a bit speculative, and but the presentation is still based on the latest legal text, related documentation, and our discussions with the authorities on the subject. So just be mindful of that going forward. So first, let's have a quick look on the Ukraine REACH registration process and the basics thereof. So a bit of repetition from the pre-registration video, but repetition is the mother of all learning, I've heard. Anyway, so substances within the scope of Ukraine REACH, these are the same substances and the same scope as for EU REACH. So if you know EU REACH, you will know what substances are completely exempt from the registration completely exempt from the Ukraine REACH regulation, or specifically exempt from the registration process, but within the scope of the regulation, but exempt from the registration process. So these are the same as under EU REACH. We will not go into details here further. Maybe subject to another webinar coming up where we, let's say, dive deep into these topics, but not here today. So some of the basic requirements, of course, for placing substances on the Ukrainian market at 1 ton or more, either as a manufacturer locally present on the Ukrainian market or as a non-Ukrainian company exporting into Ukraine, or being, of course, a Ukrainian importer. If you are importing, manufacturing, placing on the market these substances at 1 ton or more, and they are not specifically exempt from the regulation as a whole or exempt from the registration process, then you would need to pre-register and register these substances by the applicable deadlines, which we'll look at in the coming slides. The registration tonnage bands are the same as under EU REACH and many other REACH-like chemical regulations, of course, and the higher the tonnage band, the higher the data requirements in your joint submission, meaning the lead dossier in practice. We'll come back to that in a couple of slides. So 1 to 10, 10 to 100, 100 to 1,000, and over 1,000 tons. And the registration types are also the same as under EU REACH, for example. So typically would be registering a full substance, but in some cases, if those substance is intended to be transformed into another substance during the life cycle of its existence, if you will, then of course it can be also registered as an intermediate, other than on-site isolated intermediate or a transported isolated intermediate. But if you want to benefit from lesser data requirements, then you would need to have this under strictly controlled conditions during the whole life cycle of the substance, and for transported isolated intermediates through the whole supply chain, which may be a bit of an issue in some cases. Looking at the timeline for pre-registration and registration, so as we looked in the pre-registration video, today we are here in the implementation phase after the approval, which was in the summer, and now before the entry into force of the Ukraine REACH, which is the 23rd of January next year, so 2025. At this point in time, when it enters into force in January, this is where the pre-registration phase kicks off and lasts for 12 months, ending at on the 23rd of January 2026. It is possible to late pre-register if you are placing a substance on the market for the first time after this deadline. Then it is possible to late pre-register. But please have a look at the pre-registration video for more details. Once you've pre-registered, of course, the next hurdle will be to prepare the registration dossier and have it submitted by these applicable registration deadlines, which will be the 1st of October 2026 for these higher over 1,000 ton substances, and then of course these nastier substances such as 1 or more tons of a CMR substance, over 100 tons of a very toxic to aquatic organisms substance. These will have the first deadline coming up 1st of October 26. Then for the lesser tonnage bands, 100 to 1,000, you will have more time, all the way until the 1st of June 2028 to prepare and submit your dossier and have it registered by this deadline. And then for the smallest tonnage bands, 10 to 100, and of course the smallest 1 to 10, you will have all the way until 1st of March 2030 time to prepare and submit your registration dossier and have it registered by this deadline. We'll look at these deadlines in a bit more in upcoming slides. So as also mentioned in the pre-registration video, all companies registering the same substance need to take part in a joint submission. In some cases, opt-out is possible, but essentially everyone would have to take part in the same joint submission. So opt-out of specific endpoints, but that's a separate topic for a separate video or webinar. So they have to take part in this joint submission, and the lead registrant then submits the co-registration data as part of the joint submission to this the authorities in Ukraine, and the authority is the Ministry of Environmental Protection and Natural Resources of Ukraine. So we call it in this presentation, we call it MEPR. So this is one company that is selected as the lead registrant by all other companies that are aiming to register the same substance. We'll talk about this a bit more. So you can have only one lead registrant, but you can have 0 to many co-registrants. And why 0 is because if you are the only registrant for a substance, then obviously you will also become the lead registrant. But you will not have any co-registrant in that joint submission. But in most cases you will have one lead and several co-registrants joining the same joint submission with the aim to submit their registrations to the authorities by the applicable registration deadlines. So if we look at the general process from pre-registration to registration, this is the same we looked at in the pre-registration video, but still just to show you an overview. So if you are manufacturer in or import into Ukraine 1 ton or more of a non-exempt substance per legal entity, you will have to pre-register that by 23rd of January 2026. By pre-registering, you will become a member of a pre-CIF, and this constitutes the pre-registration process, and this was covered in a separate video here on YouTube. From here on, you will agree on the substance sameness and select the lead registrant. At this point, it will become a CIF, more or less, with potential registrants, early registrants, data holders being part of this CIF. Essentially all the companies that are aiming to register the same substance and have agreed on the substance sameness. Then these companies will prepare to register as part of a joint submission by the applicable registration deadlines. And this constitutes the registration process, which will be the topic of this presentation. coming up now in the next section. So now we will look at the registration under Ukraine REACH and the basics thereof. So we will not be looking at all the processes in detail or steps thereof at this point in time. These will be subject to separate videos and specifically webinars. So let's look at the workflow for registering. In this case, we are looking at the so-called non-consortium approach, where there is not a consortium, but there's a lead registrant who takes the lead in preparing and submitting the joint submission on behalf of everyone else, and everyone else then are co-registrants and prepare their own dossiers and submit them to the ministry. So this is an overview thereof. So you're a manufacturer, importer, or an only representative for a substance at 1 ton or more annually, which is of course not exempt from the registration work under Ukraine REACH. So what you do is you pre-register and then become a member of the CIF. So first we had the pre-CIF and then the CIF once you've agreed on the substance sameness. You can look at this the previous pre-registration video for more details on the pre-registration part. You need to select a lead registrant. Then once you have the lead registrant selected, typically they will come out and propose a CIF agreement defining the rules of cooperation, data sharing and cost sharing, very important of course, but this leverages the learnings we've and companies have gotten from EU REACH and of course Turkey, KKDIK and K-REACH and so forth. So it's the same type of processes, and of course EU REACH back in the day. Then you undertake data sharing, check what data is available in your own CIF by at the co-registrants, potential registrants. You make a data gap analysis, essentially checking what are there any gaps. Do we have to do additional testing? Do we have to buy? What data do we still have to buy through read across and so forth? And that brings us to the next step, which is data access negotiation and data collection. So typically under Ukraine REACH, as under Turkey, KKDIK, you would not have to do additional tests because all information is already available. So it's a matter of negotiating access to that data from existing data holders and collecting that information. Then, of course, once you've received legitimate access to the data from various data holders from within your CIF and so forth, then you prepare the lead registration dossier. You submit it to the MEPR, so the ministry. Once you've submitted your lead dossier, you can do this in parallel also, but here it's very linear. So we look at this in a linear fashion, and the next step would be performing law calculations, as this is done by typically the lead registrant in this non-consortium approach. Then you issue a letter of access to all the co-registrants, making it available. So essentially co-registrants will have to purchase the letter of access and sign related agreement or agreements depending on the setup. And then it is the co-registrants who then need to prepare their own dossiers, submit them to the ministry, and enjoy having your substance Ukraine REACH registered. And of course, as we all know, with all REACH-like chemical regulations, specifically those that are more almost clones of EU REACH, it is not a destination, it's a journey. So what that means is you will still need to keep your registrations, lead registrations, co-registrations up to date for as long as you are relying on those registrations, according to the developments of the Ukraine REACH legislation and of course the legal requirements and so forth. If new information becomes available, then that information needs to be taken into account in these dossiers and reflected in the registration, and that may lead to a requirement to update these dossiers. Very similar to that of under EU REACH. So what is a lead registrant? The lead registrant we saw in the previous slides, and this will be actually something that we will have separate webinars and also be posted here on YouTube, where we go into this, really the nitty-gritties of what it means and so forth. But that's really not the focus at this point, because focus will be on the pre-registration, but still we will give you an overview what these are, what these different roles of registrants are at this point. We'll then go into much more detail in coming webinars, etc. So the lead registrant takes upon itself the responsibility, again in this SIEF, so the Substance Information Exchange Fora, to coordinate the work, get everyone aligned in their work to register jointly this substance, so essentially get organized. They of course also have to clarify the substance identity. They typically issue a draft SIP, Substance Information Identity Profile, Substance Identity Profile, SIP, that is then reviewed and commented by all the members intending to register, and eventually this will be clarified into the final SIP, defining and clarifying the substance identity. Typically that is the point where actually the pre-SIEF turns into a SIEF. That's according to the prevailing, let's say, praxis in these cases. Then the lead also collects and assembles the required data to fill the data requirements. So this is, as we discussed in the previous slides, entails checking what's available in the SIEF, but most of it actually will be available from the data holders under EU REACH, because those are the data holders who had to do all the analytical studies and tests on these substances and prepare the dossier back in the day for EU REACH, and that process is ongoing when new information becomes available, and you have to take that into account in registration dossiers and so forth. But that endpoint data is available for purchase and should be used also for Ukraine REACH for the purpose of using the same master data set across all different regulations, so that they're not deviating from one another, because that would not be beneficial to anyone. Then the lead of course also prepares the chemical safety report for substances that are over 10 tons per year, and as part of the CSR also prepares the exposure assessments for these classified substances. We will not go into those details here in this video. And also the lead registrant, as we saw in the previous slide, shares these costs fairly, transparently and non-discriminatorily with all the registrants that are intending to register the same substance through this letter of access process, so this law process. Furthermore, obviously, they need to manage and submit the joint registration to the ministry in good time before the applicable registration deadlines, and then facilitate, of course, the process for other companies to join the joint submission, and that is done through the letter of access process. But then, as mentioned, REACH and any REACH like chemical regulations, they're not a destination, and registration is not a destination, it's a journey, so you will need to continuously keep your registration and the lead dossier up to date, and keep records of any updates and any compliance topics and issues you are having, and all the work that you are doing to comply with Ukraine REACH, and of course communicate with authorities when they are or potentially are contacting you on various topics. As a lead, the data requirements, as discussed in the beginning, are dependent on the tonnage band you are intending to register, and the joint submission, of course, meaning what is the highest tonnage band of the registrants in your joint submission. Typically that would be the lead registrant, not in all cases, but typically. And the higher you go, the higher the tonnage band, higher the data requirements will be. So the start from Annex 7, 8, 9 and 10. The higher the tonnage band, the more data is required. More annexes need to be covered. Plus then you need also to include the chemical safety report for substances over 10 tons annually, and then the exposure assessment for hazardous substances. But as I said, we will not look into those in detail. These are not applicable to intermediates under strictly controlled conditions, because those to be benefit from lesser data requirements, which is essentially no data or at max equivalent to Annex 7 data, you need to have be under strictly controlled conditions. But we will not talk about intermediates here in detail. That's a topic for another session and a video. So if we want to show these information requirements as numbers, so the endpoints aggregated here, you start with 26 and end up with total of 65 endpoints that need to be satisfied. Some may be waived depending on exposure based criteria and so forth. But if you would have to populate everything, you would have 65 endpoints for over 1,000 ton substances that need to be registered. But rarely you have to populate everything. And this is the same as under EU REACH. So again, you will hear this a lot, the same as EU REACH. What will be important, as we've seen from, for example, Turkey, is that it is to be able to successfully register your substance, you will have to have legitimate access to the data that you need in the joint submission. So in the lead dossier that you are referring to in the joint submission by every registrant, having this legitimate access will be a key activity. So you need to find and negotiate and get the necessary agreements to be able to use that data for Ukraine REACH purposes. And if you are a lead registrant, then of course having sub-licensing rights would be preferable, but in some cases, and we expect this to happen also under Ukraine REACH as it's happening under Turkey, is that some data holders will issue separate letter of accesses for select endpoints separately. So it might be, and likely will be, so that when you are registering under Ukraine REACH, you will have to buy separate pieces of a letter of access. So essentially separate letter of accesses for different parts of information and so forth. We will discuss this separately in a future video, as said, when we are going into the nitty-gritties of the registration process. And as with all REACH-like chemical regulations, it's expected that the data will be the most expensive part of the Ukraine REACH registration process, whether you are the lead or a co-registrant. That is typically the way. This does not apply in cases where you would be registering an intermediate. So a bit of a caveat there. Very important also under Ukraine REACH is to highlight that the same transparency or these transparent, fair and non-discriminatory data sharing rules also apply in Ukraine REACH as it does for EU REACH, for example. So this is, as they are more or less a copy of the EU REACH regulation, this also means that these transparency, fairness and non-discriminatory clauses have also been included in Ukraine REACH and need to be followed. Very important. As said, will be subject to a separate video/webinar by REACHLaw. So what is a co-registrant? So the co-registrant is the zero to many who are joining the joint submission. In many cases, of course, you will have several co-registrants, and they are individually then responsible for their own registration, but they also have to cooperate in the pre-sieve to agree on the sameness of the substance, and in the sieve, and of course in selecting the lead registrant, share data, share costs when they purchase the letter of access. Of course, they need to compile their own dossier and submit it to the ministry before the applicable registration deadlines, and also keep their own co-registration dossier up to date, and also keep records of their compliance work and efforts pertaining to Ukraine REACH, and where need be, of course, communicate with authorities when authorities are reaching out to you for whatever issues or topics. So now let's look at this simplified registration process and what does it mean under Ukraine REACH. And this is, I think, one of the most commonly asked questions, I would say. Well, what does simplified registration mean? So this simplified registration procedure in Ukraine applies for EU REACH registered substance, and it's defined under Ukraine REACH Articles 26 to 27. And what it means is that companies in the EU and the European Economic Area that are manufacturers or importers, or then of course only representatives in some cases, can benefit from this simplified registration according to Ukraine REACH. So what it means is that when these EU manufacturers or EU importers that have REACH registered a substance, when these companies appoint, well, importers cannot appoint, but manufacturers and formulators, when they appoint an only representative under Ukraine REACH, they can benefit from these simplified registration procedures. So it means that if you are an EU holder of registration and you appoint an only representative under Ukraine REACH, you, as a holder of EU registration by proxy through the only representative in Ukraine REACH, can benefit from this simplified registration process. Well, I'll show you in the next slide what the information is included, or what needs to be included in the simplified registration. But as you can already see, it of course gives you a clear benefit for EU REACH registration holders, because they can benefit from this simplified registration process, whilst practically not helping the Ukrainian industry at all, except of course in cases where such companies have EU REACH registered their substances through an EU REACH only representative on the other hand. So to benefit, and I mentioned this already, but to benefit from this, take benefit of this simplified registration procedure, if you are a holder of a EU REACH registration, then as a manufacturer or formulator, then you can and you should appoint, of course, an Ukraine REACH only representative to take benefit of the simplified registration process for the substances that you're placing on the Ukrainian market. So what does the simplified registration dossier include then? So it includes, of course, a technical dossier, so a Euclid dossier in a Euclid format. So a dataset is compiled and the dossier is submitted, containing the following: of course, the basic information as you have in all registration dossiers, so information on the registrant, substance ID, annual volume information, production process, applicable only to Ukraine manufacturers in this case, description of the uses, description of uses advised against, but then also classification labeling information. This is typically not normally included in co-registration, and then waste handling information. And what is not included typically in co-registration either is, of course, study summaries, robust study summaries used to cover data requirements, and if there are any testing proposals pending. And then for 1 to 10 ton substances that do not require CSR, use and exposure information based on a use descriptor system. And optionally, you can provide also confidentiality claims here in this technical Euclid dossier. On top of that, for over 10 ton substances, you also need to provide a chemical safety report as an annex to the dossier, so likely under section 13 of the Euclid, in the Euclid dossier, where required, obviously. So only for over 10 ton substances. And then as a third point, a confirmation of the EU REACH registration. So essentially it says documentary evidence. In practice, this could be, for example, attaching the decision letter that you get in REACH IT when you have registered a substance, and attaching that then to the dossier in in under section 13 or so, for example, or provided separately as will be guided separate, or guidance will be provided separately on these topics. So as you can already see here, you are providing study summaries, robust study summaries, meaning you have to essentially have access to this information and more, and then you also need to provide chemical safety report information. This is something that you also need to have access to. All the other information, in most cases, you do have access to, as well as, of course, your decision letter. But here you can already see that, okay, now we are submitting study summaries and robust study summaries that we prepared for EU REACH for Ukraine REACH purposes. So herein lies some of the problems, is that of course when we are doing a simplified registration, then we are referring to EU REACH data in the submission under Ukraine REACH. So in general, EU REACH data cannot be used verbatim, if you will, for Ukraine REACH purposes. You have to have legitimate access to refer to that data in the dossier under Ukraine REACH. So it's not a simple fact, unless you own this data yourself. But in most cases, you would not own it yourself. You would own it as part of a joint submission or a consortium, but typically they limit it to specific jurisdictions, as of which I don't think Ukraine is still included in those. In some cases it might, but likely not. So in any case, you would have to have legitimate access to the data that is referred in the simplified registration for use under Ukraine REACH. And that brings us back to, well, what is the benefit then? Well, the benefit is that you would have a slightly lesser authority registration fee, which we'll look at in just a few slides. Also, there are some questions, albeit not big things, but how would these simplified registrants be treated in the joint submission compared with these regular registrants? What would be their obligations for additional tests or additional data, additional costs, and so forth? I think they would just simply be integrated into the normal joint submission, and they would have the same obligations as the rest of them, except for the data portion, if they already have legitimate access to that data to be used for Ukraine REACH. But that is I would say, a fairly seldom case. How would these simplified registrations be included in the joint submissions? Would it be grandfathered like under UK REACH in this case? I think that would probably be the way. They would just simply be included in the joint submission, so not a big deal. And then the question also, can simplified registrants be lead registrants? As in many cases, the EU REACH lead registrants would likely want to become also a lead registrant under Ukraine REACH, and they are probably the ones who will also be then appointing an only representative, for example, in Ukraine, to take benefit of this simplified registration process, provided they are manufacturers or formulators who can appoint an only representative. As said, that will be discussed in a separate video. So a bit of open questions. Biggest thing is the data access and how to treat that, because that is really the aimed benefit here with the simplified process, albeit probably not entirely thoroughly thought through. So we'll see how this pans out in practice. So, as pertaining to panning out in practice, the Ukrainian authorities have noted during a consultation in the spring this year that the simplified registration process may not be applied at all, although it would be included in the regulation. I think they come to the realization that there are quite a lot of hurdles pertaining to data access rights and so forth, which would have been the only clear benefit of doing a simplified registration. So if that's taken away, then what's the point of having a simplified registration, except that you will see there will be a slightly lower registration fee. So we'll just have to wait and see what will happen with the simplified registration process, what it means in practice. So be sure to follow us on our YouTube channel, of course, here, and then but also on our newsletter. So if you're not subscribed, please subscribe to that. You'll find a link on our webpage, reachlaw.fi, and also, of course, you can follow us on LinkedIn. So we're following the developments of the simplified registration process, and we will absolutely provide more details when more information becomes available. So we provide that in webinars, newsletters, and LinkedIn posts, and so forth. And all of these videos should eventually trickle down here to YouTube for your viewing pleasure, if you can call it that. So looking at just the registration deadlines again, so a bit different format here. So substances as such as part of mixtures at over 1,000 tons, CMR substances over 1 ton, at 1 ton or more, substances are very toxic to aquatic organisms, acute and chronic. 100 tons or more will have the first registration deadline, 1st of October 2026. And Ukraine REACH takes the win here, because it will be the first deadline, registration deadline of all these other REACH-like regulations, except for, of course, K-REACH. But for example, it will beat UK REACH by a couple of weeks, and Turkey KKDIK with a couple of months, because UK REACH will have the 27th of October 26th, the first deadline, whilst the first deadline under Turkey will be end of the year 2026. So if this would be a competition, then Ukraine REACH would win in this case, unless there will be changes to UK or UK REACH registration deadlines, for example. Well, they would still win. Anyway, the next deadline is 1st of June 2028 for 100 to 1,000 ton substances, and then the lesser tonnage band, as mentioned, 1 to 10, 10 to 100 would be 1st of March 2030. So in all of these cases, it will just be a bit earlier than the equivalent regulations in the UK and in Turkey, for example. So funny fact there. Looking at this visually, we looked at it already. Just wanted to highlight what it looks like. Here you can see that the first deadline will come quite quickly, 1st of October 2026. After that, if you are placing any of these substances for the first time on the Ukrainian market, you will have to go through an inquiry and then registration before you can start placing these substances at 1 ton or more on the Ukrainian market. So the same as under EU REACH, and the same applies for the other tonnage bands after their applicable registration deadline. So 1st of June 28 for the 100 to 1,000, and then 1st of March 2030 for the smallest tonnage bands, 1 to 10, 10 to 100 ton substances. So after that, after this deadline, 1st of March 2030, there will be no deadlines anymore, these sort of transitional phase-in deadlines under Ukraine REACH, and you will always have to inquire and register before you are placing a substance on the Ukrainian market at 1 ton or more. So the registration system used will be a Euclid, where you prepare the registration dossiers, inquiries, P-ports, and so forth. Also the CLP notification dossiers, however, not initially, because there's no preparedness to accept these Euclid files yet at the ministry. The iEuclid software is used obviously for EU REACH. It's also used in the back end of KKDIK, but it's also used for UK REACH purposes, and it will also be used for Ukraine REACH compliance purposes, as well as Ukraine CLP, subject to another video. And this iEuclid is free software available for download, and you can use it free of charge, and here you can find more information if you want to at this provided link for additional details. The IT systems, so for submission and a sort of a information portal similar to that of a REACH IT and the ECHA dissemination tool. So in June this year, 2024, they were created They were envisaging, and they approved this single online system for ensuring chemical safety to be created, and it will be launched as part of this so-called ecosystem service, which is already available for in Ukraine. This is, by the way, just a translated view because it's only available in Ukrainian, obviously. Through this ecosystem for Ukraine REACH purposes, companies will be able to submit their dossiers under Ukraine REACH, but also under Ukraine CLP notification, for example, notifications and alternative name requests and so forth. But then general public will be able to look at basic information about the registered substances, substances in general, and the classification, labeling information, use-related information, information about the registrants, manufacturers, importers, other suppliers of chemical products, etc. So very similar to that of ECHA REACH IT, the classification, labeling, inventory, and ECHA Chem and the dissemination tool in general. But this is work in progress, so we'll see how this develops. So we are following developments of this IT submission system closely. It is not there yet, so for your information. And then finally, on these authority registration fees, so these are calculated a bit differently because they're based on a so-called subsistence minimum and coefficients that are then multiplied together. So here on the left hand side you have different criteria: tonnage band, submission type of registration, company size, and then you have coefficients for different tonnage bands and submission types. Individual, it says individual here. This will highly likely not be available in practice because there will be the OSOR principle, one substance, one registration, also under Ukraine REACH. So either it will be a joint submission or EU REACH register. This implies that it would be falling under the simplified procedure. So if we multiply these coefficients, here you can see for full substance, intermediate, and then company size also brings its, takes into account the company size and the coefficients thereof. So the bigger the company size, the larger the cost. So what you do is you take the subsistence minimum, which is 2,920 hryvnia. Sorry for all the Ukrainians on listening, my pronunciation is probably very bad, but still you take that subsistence minimum times the tonnage band coefficient times the submission type coefficient times the type of registration coefficient times the company size coefficient. So you go through this for each substance and then you end up with your registration fee. And just to make it very simple, looking at exchange rates of now more or less today, you will see that if you are not eligible for the simplified registration, these would be the registration fees for large company size, 300 to 6,525 euros. Then the smaller the company size, then of course it will be less. For intermediates, it's less. But then if you are doing a simplified registration, it's even less. So you can see that it's essentially the half. You have the full fees, and then you have the simplified registration fees. So this, if all else fails with the simplified registration process, if they still keep it, but essentially you have to do the same work as for doing any other registration under Ukraine REACH, but they retain these fees, then at least you will have your authority fees a bit less. And of course for intermediates it's less. So I invite you to just pause the video, look at this in detail. We will not go through it here. But all in all, clearly cheaper than in the EU, but at the end of the day, not so cheap if you have a lot of substances, and absolutely more expensive than, for example, Turkey. So guidance and help desk related topics. So there are no guidances at the moment. the Ukrainian authorities are developing guidance and support mechanisms and help desks eventually, but at the moment it is still pending. Likely many of these guidance documents will be based on, of course, the ECHA guidance equivalents, albeit they will be in a Ukrainian language. And this also applies to Ukraine CLP. In any case, REACHLaw is following the developments of the Ukraine REACH registration process very closely. So for the best way for you to keep track of these developments under Ukraine REACH, please just sign up for our newsletter if you haven't done so already at reachlaw.fi, and you go to the subscribe section. That is the best way to keep track of things. And of course, feel free also to sign up to our LinkedIn profile, and there we will also be, of course, posting news about Ukraine REACH. And of course, follow us here on YouTube, subscribe and like if you find this video informative, albeit it's already a bit long. So at the end, of course, we are happy to help you with everything Ukraine REACH and CLP related. So just feel free to reach out to us at REACHLaw, for example, at sales@reachlaw.fi, to ask for a quotation, for example, for only representation for your specific substance scope, or just receiving a price list. That's fine. But anyway, please reach out. We'd be happy to help. And here you can find our contact details. So Lesia Winterberg, my colleague, and I, Fredrik Johansson. You find our contact details. Feel free to reach out to us at any time, contact us for questions and ask for quotations, etc. So with that, thank you very much for watching all the way to the end, and I wish you a very great day. Bye-bye.